Rachel Reeves' spring statement, Donald Trump and JD Vance, Erdoğan in Turkey, Marine Le Pen in France. Much for us to reflect upon in this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Hey, it worked.
Welcome back to the Downtown Den Politics podcast. And yes, I have returned after a bout of man flu. Back in the seat with my erstwhile colleagues Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. And we are going to be, as I say, talking about Rachel Reeves' spring statement. We'll also be looking at some other domestic issues relating to immigration and a controversy that has reared its head over prison sentencing. So we'll be taking a glance at that as well. And then in the second part of the programme, we'll go international and look at what Mr. Trump has been up to and his kindred spirit in Turkey, Erdoğan, and some of the concerning things that are happening in that part of the world. But let's start with that spring statement. So Rachel Reeves, this was not an emergency budget, and I think it was fair enough for her to say that because this had been pending for many months as a fiscal event, I think is how we describe these things. And basically, she used it to announce cuts in welfare that enable her to stay within these very tight fiscal rules that she's basically placed herself within. I'm still a little baffled as to why she is continuing to remain in that straitjacket, but then I've been listening to economists, and good thing about being off sick is they get you to listen to all sorts of crap that you wouldn't be able to usually listen to. And very mixed reviews in a sense. So an awful lot of them are saying, look, it's 6 months in to her chancellorship. She is not going to abandon the rules that she set just 6 months ago at the first call of asking. So that is the case for the defence in a sense. The other points that be made, and I said this in a blog on Friday when I was trying to be a little bit upbeat around the economy, is that if you look at international investment, if you look at the strength of the pound against the dollar, if you look at the stabilisation of interest rates, and then you also take into account the reforms that Labour are driving through on things such as infrastructure planning, house building, then she is hoping and betting on the fact that when she takes to the dispatch box again in October, she will be able to say, there you go, I've stuck within my fiscal rules and we've got some growth in the economy. Now, of course, there are negatives and there are downsides to the economic news, not least what is happening as far as tariffs are concerned with Donald Trump, and we'll come back to that more so in the second part of the programme. But Jim, what did you make of it? Because a fortnight ago you were saying, yes, I'm all in favour of welfare cuts. All these bloody shirkers need to have the benefits absolutely scrapped. What's she waiting for?
Well, that of course is a caricature of my position. But I do, if we're going to talk about the broad issue of the welfare state, I do broadly take the view that there needs to be reform, whatever our compassionate instincts, that the huge ballooning budget for welfare is unsustainable. So it's not for me to invite, but I mean the government invites us all to say what we're going to do about it. And the other thing is that it's not often said in these forums, but there is a widespread perception, and it fuels Reform UK, which I think is a continuing and growing problem, that there are shirkers, people who are finding it too easy to plead mental illness and all this sort of stuff and get these benefits. Now, that sounds incredibly harsh, and I have listened, as we all have in the last week or two, to the really sad cases where this is going to impinge. So that's my overall view on that. Obviously, politically, it is spectacular. I think, is it 500,000 extra children are going to be put into poverty? I mean, that is a spectacular.
I think we've got to be careful throwing that figure about, to be fair, because I thought Darren Jones, although he got himself into a little bit of difficulty trying to make a comparison over his kids' pocket money, which is unfortunate, he made the point that if the changes that the government are wishing to introduce around creating opportunities for many of these people, then that figure will be significantly less than 500,000. So I think that is a headline figure that, of course, is going to be used particularly by the left, the Liberals and the Greens. But I think realistically, the figure is going to be much less than that. And of course, what Labour would say is many of those people will be better off because of the changes that are going to be made.
Yes, it depends on the response of employers, of course, in being prepared to take on people who might be, to use the horrible euphemism, challenging to employ. But how that's going to work, how the job centres are going to interact with employers to actually help some of these people back to work. Because I thought the mantra, the clues in the word labour, labour means working. And I thought the presentation of that was quite good. By the way, I thought that in a very tricky corner, Rachel Reeves, performed quite robustly, as indeed, in my opinion, did a gentleman whose name I have mentioned before on this podcast, Mr. Mel Stride. Yep. The more I hear him, the more I like him. He's got a sense of humour. He did a podcast on the BBC where he did a quiz and all this sort of stuff. He's a very, able-rounded man. And of course,
FYNX, Jim.
And of course, he taunted them with this. It was an emergency budget, which is dexterous politics. It's a sort of positive attitude that the Conservative Party needs. That the mayor for Teesside, Ben Houchin, last week accused the Conservatives of being incapable of doing, and that they weren't being relevant. But just to finish off my answer, and to address what you said, the straitjacket thing. I mean, there was an opportunity that the Germans have taken to say that the changed circumstances, and the government keep on referring to the fact that things have changed dramatically since November, to actually emerge from the straitjacket. She chose not to do it. The last thing I want to say is that because of this incredibly narrow margins that she left for herself. I mean, it was unbelievable that she left the margin at 2:00 in the afternoon when she finished speaking, and then of course at 6:00 the orange man from United States blew it out of the water. So we're in a difficult situation, and the worrying thing, and I agree with you, Frank. You're entitled to make the optimistic thing that there might be a bit of growth because of all the defence and house building and that sort of thing that we're going to do. But the worrying thing is that the margin has now disappeared within about 2 hours. And there could be a build-up of a narrative over the summer into the autumn, exactly the same as last year, that more taxes are on the way. And frankly, the state of morale in the Labour Party, if it builds up and then becomes a reality in the autumn that she's forced to do more taxes, that's going to be very difficult indeed.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge that she faces, that this fiscal, as I say, straitjacket that she's placed herself in. And I'm not sure that she's got any wiggle room for tax increases, I have to say. So the only place I can see her going, and it will be difficult because it will be a U-turn, but it will be to change those fiscal rules. And it was done by Thatcher's government in the early 80s. It was done by Osborne in the sort of 2011, 2012, couple of years into his chancellorship. So she won't be the first chancellor to have changed tack. But I think her narrative may be of being a little softer in terms of the way she expressed the view. She was determined. I can't remember exactly the word she used, but it was sort of, no going back. These are my fiscal rules. We're absolutely going to stick to them. I think she should have been a little more subtle in terms of that response. The other thing that I think will have been of concern to many in the Labour Party is the fact that this was probably the first Chancellor's statement that I can remember where the word social justice have not been used during the presentation. I take your point, Jim. I thought it was a very competent performance from Rachel Reeves and was received far better from the Labour benches behind her than any would have anticipated. Nevertheless, privately, there are a lot of MPs, a lot of Labour MPs, who are expressing disappointment in the approach that the Chancellor has taken, saying she's just simply taking the Treasury line here. And Joe, I'm thinking you probably got a bit more sympathy with people who have taken that sort of critical view of this spring statement.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I broadly agree with everybody who says the benefit bill is unsustainable. I mean, it's ridiculous. And part of that, I think, does stem from COVID and people not going to work and not getting used to work and people being paid to stay at home and all of that sort of stuff. I think I completely agree. She was very confident and she was extremely confident in her broadcast rounds after the statement. And she did do a really good thing on Radio 4 on the Today programme the following morning, where she said, these are the things that we've done, and she listed the things that they've done. That's what they need to keep doing, because at the moment, most people, including me, are going, okay, the finances are rubbish, thanks to 14 years of the Conservative Party, including Mel Stride, sorry, Jim, global affairs, etc., etc. But you are attacking the people at the bottom of the pile. Where is the tax on wealth? That I think is what people find very difficult to correlate with a Labour government. That, yes, we can say we've got to get people benefits, we've got to get them back to work with all the caveats and the challenges that presents. But what is happening to the people who've got the broadest shoulders? They are walking away scot-free. And I think that's the problem. And if I was a new Labour MP, I would, I'd want it a bit quicker than tomorrow for it to be Labour is working, for them to be able to show that they are getting people back to work rather than just off benefits and into deeper poverty and despair.
I think I mentioned in the blog on Friday that I'd spoken to a couple of Labour officials last week, and one of them said to me, we've inherited 14 years of shit, at least give us 14 months to sort it out.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a good line, actually, and one perhaps the Chancellor should be using herself. I think also what I would say is that in terms of a wealth tax, which is always thrown around as an easy place to go, I remember sitting in endless briefings with Treasury officials, and this is when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, basically explaining to us that once you hit a particular point in taxation, you will start to see your tax take going down rather than increasing if you increase it again, because these people are dealing in a global economy and they can put their money anywhere. So if you start to get to the point where they feel as though they are being absolutely screwed by UK PLC, they'll just move the cash, Joe. And that's the problem. And I think that wealth tax is a thing that for me has connotations beyond fairness. And I always go back to the point of canvassing in Skelmersdale, of all places, in 1983, when Michael Foot was the leader of the Labour Party, and we were campaigning on that manifesto that was described afterwards by Peter Shaw as the longest suicide note in history. And people in Skelmersdale were saying to me, well, it's not fair that people should be paying 50% of their income in tax. So I think that politically, and also actually financially prudently, it's not the way to go. We're taxing people more now than we've ever taxed them. So we've got to find a way of being more efficient and more effective in terms of the way that we spend the money that we're collecting, Joe.
Can I just come in on this tax thing? Okay, if we take Frank's point on the wealth tax, Joe, what about increasing gambling tax but more importantly, on the social media companies,
Yes. No, absolutely.
which we
I
should
think-
be increasing tax on.
Yeah.
But there's a prospect that to appease Trump, we're going to abolish the
Yeah.
digital tax.
Exactly. And I think the point, wealth tax is a lazy shorthand, and so I shouldn't have used it, because it's not necessarily wealthy individuals, but there are companies and organizations who can well afford. And frankly, you know, if we lost X, who gives a monkeys? The other thing that I think is really significant, and you've touched on it a little bit, Frank, is that we are all being taxed at the highest rate forever. Anybody who's going to get an increase in their minimum wage or their pensions or their benefits may well find themselves pushed into that tax bracket. And I think that's significant. So she could actually, you know, she could have raised the threshold at the bottom by £1,500 or £2,000 a year or something, which would mean that some people stay out of the tax bracket. Because what is the incentive to go to work if that then hits you're paying tax?
Make work
And
pay,
that
yeah.
has an
Make
impact on
work
all
pay.
sorts of things.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Make work pay. But I think also the narrative does matter, you see. And I think wealth tax, I know it's not the phrase that you would necessarily use, but it is the one that's thrown about mostly by people on the left. And it does send a signal to entrepreneurs, to investors. Oof, be careful. You know, the UK don't like wealthy people, and that's not the message any government wants to send out. But you're right as well, Jim. You know, an awful lot of this, isn't it strange that, you know, the whole Brexit debate was around taking back control, and yet the whole policy decision making of our government now seems to be getting dictated to by America. And Farage totally buys into that. So we haven't taken back control at all, have we? We've just said, basically, whatever the states are doing, we've got to fall in line with that. It's ridiculous, Jim.
Yes, we're probably going to come on to this later when we talk more about Trump and so on. But as you've raised it in that form, you know, we are reaching a crossroads here. And this is going to happen in the next couple of days, apparently, because April the 2nd is meant to be Trump's Liberation Day, where all these tariffs are going to be imposed. And, you know, as we speak now, there are active negotiations going on, which, if I can caricature it, seems to be to let the United Kingdom off. Now, that will be a huge breach with Europe. And, of course, it will allow our Leaver friends to say, look at the freedoms that Brexit have given us to negotiate with the United States. But then, of course, the point that you make is enforced, that we are, the special relationship is alive and well, or the compliant relationship, if you want to call it that. We are at the behest of the United States, and not the United States under a sort of benign leader, but under a leader who's contemplating breaking the Constitution to stand again.
Well, this brings me to my final point on the spring statement and the biggest disappointment I had with Rachel's presentation. No mention at all of the damage to the economy that Brexit has done. And if you are not prepared to make that statement now, when are you going to be prepared?
Absolutely.
All the evidence shows that it's been hugely damaging to the UK economy. If you want to get business on side, back on side, then one of the quickest ways you could do that is to say that you are determined to start to do sensible, pragmatic trade deals with your European neighbours. And why she hasn't done that yet is beyond comprehension to me. I think the only disappointment I'd suggest in terms of our relationship with the EU, which is getting better, and Keir Starmer's done a great job, I think, in terms of re-establishing Britain's reputation on the international stage, was Macron and his statement about excluding the UK from the defence procurement project because of some bloody fishing row. Now, you know, come on, Emmanuel, let's get real here. We're talking about a world that is being reordered and in crisis, and you're going on about a few bloody cod in the North Sea. So I think from both sides of that fence, we really do need to see European leaders get their act together. But as I say, Joe, disappointing not to hear Rachel Reeves at least begin to spell out the case as to why a new trade deal with the EU is a
Absolutely.
good thing.
And we are far enough away from that disastrous referendum for government to start reminding people of the damage it has done. Why have we got a shortage of bricklayers? Well, they all went back to Poland. Why have we got highest ever legal migration? Because we're having to bring in people from Nigeria and India and the Philippines to take up those care jobs and nursing jobs, depriving their own countries of health professionals. And I think the Macron point, although I sort of thought, oh, that's a bit chippy, but in a way that's him doing what our government should be doing, because Keir Starmer should have said, of course, had we not left Europe, we would have been able to get this contract. And the one thing I would mention, we talk about, yes, we think cutting the benefit bill is a good idea. There are many disappointments in the spring budget. But within 24 hours, the announcement of the closure of the British Steelworks at Scunthorpe, that's 3,000 people losing their jobs. That's 3,000 families who are suddenly going to be plunged into that world of either looking for a job that doesn't exist or unemployment benefit and everything that goes with that. And, you get that. And that's when it comes into this thing about wealth. And it might be very simplistic and very sort of binary to say tax the rich. But, you want £1 billion from the government to bail out a private company. We've just seen Thames Water get, an extension on their loans. I mean, why? And I think that's the thing that people can't grapple with. It's easier to hit, the person who's disabled who can't get a job despite wanting to work than it is to take on these big companies. And I think, when we talk about wealth tax, yes, we should be more nuanced, but there are companies who are being rewarded time and time again for failure, and we are all paying for it.
Can I just have a quick word on the government's position on Europe? And I think there are two things in play. I think there's still this residual fear in Labour that they can't defy their voters in their 2016 decision. And that's reinforced by the fear of Reform UK. It's giving that more energy. Even though you're absolutely right, Frank, that the opportunity to say we are in, because the government keep on saying they justified the spring statement cuts on the grounds that things had changed since November. Well, things have certainly changed since 2016, but they don't seem to want to use that argument. And I think the reason is that there's this balancing act going on that Starmer is doing with some skill in some ways of trying to keep our European partners on board whilst looking to some sort of trade deal with the United States. And therefore, because Trump has this visceral hatred of the EU, it's an incredible balancing act for Starmer to do.
But I think if you look at the trade figures and you take the EU as a whole, then we do far more with them than we do with America. Now, I know everyone says as a country, we trade more with America. Well, of course, because fucking the biggest country in the world, right? So, of course, in terms of trade and a country, but in terms of a trading bloc, the EU is far more important to us. And for me, I would be taking the view now, you see, much like Canada, I think, that our relationships moving forward need to be with maybe the emerging nations, maybe India, maybe, dare I say it, more trade with China, because at least you know what you're getting with China. You could sign a deal on Tuesday with Trump. He can rip it up on Wednesday, Jim.
Exactly.
And you've destroyed your relationship with your EU partners. I think it's a very risky business for Starmer to be playing. And yeah, I think the point you make about concern regarding, let's be lazy again in this usage of a term, but red wall voters is real. But unless and until politicians start to spell out the reality of our exclusion from that European market, then how are they going to move the dial on people's opinions?
Yeah.
If we simply stay silent on it and pretend everything is fine, I know, isn't this marvellous? We can get this trade deal with the United States, which is a pittance in comparison what you could do with the EU. Then, of course, people are going to dig in and say, "Ha, there you go, we were right all along."
And to
So
be fair to the Liberal Democrats, they have always shown
they've
that
started
principled
to-
leadership on that.
yeah, they've started to be far more robust on the issue, and rightly so. And I think that Labour will pay a heavy price if they don't start to lean in to the European Union far more than they have done so far. Let's turn quickly then to a couple of other domestic issues. There's a big summit taking place as we speak, which is why I keep glancing on my phone, where Keir Starmer has brought together 40 countries. He's good at this, isn't he? Convening people
good
to come
convener.
to London. Yeah, he's a very good convener. And my dad was a good convener back in the day. So he's brought 40 countries to London for this immigration conference, summit, sorry. And he's saying, as you would expect, illegal migration makes him angry. He's confirmed that the UK has returned 24,000 people since Labour took office in July, which I think is probably pretty impressive as a figure. And the Home Secretary is talking about tackling the gangs in the same way as you would attack terrorists. So Labour trying to get on the front foot on immigration. And I guess, Joe, this is in the lead up to a May elections, which is it's going to be challenging for Labour. There's also that by-election in Runcorn coming up. So immigration, do you feel as though Labour are starting to get a grip of it?
I mean, they've got a mountain to climb just simply because of the backlog. You know, there are still an enormous number of people waiting for their asylum claims to be processed. I think the thing that's happened is there's been a real ramping up, particularly in the Daily Telegraph, on the ridiculous cases where people have said, "Oh, you can't possibly send me back. You know, my husband won't like the hot weather in the Caribbean," or, you know, "I've joined a cult since I've been living in this country illegally for 10 years. So if you send me back to wherever it is, I'll be prosecuted." So there's all of those things which have shown up the thing. And I think, you know, if the government is serious about retaining our place, if you like, within the European Court of Human Rights and all of those very important human rights protections, they are quite right to now wake up to what people have been saying for ages. This is ridiculous. What we don't want to do is to withdraw from it. But what we actually need to do is to challenge it. And one of the other things, Frank, that he's announced today is an international unit of the Crown Prosecution Service, which I think is quite an important thing. And I think, you know, there's people were sneering at Yvette Cooper on the broadcast rounds yesterday, saying it's the weather. It is the weather. I live within 20 miles of the English Channel. When the weather is calm, people will come across. And you know that the only thing that will really stop them, and even then not always, is bad weather. So if you have a period of fine weather, the figures go up, obviously. But I think it's good that people are talking, because we've seen so many countries, you know, Poland's having a crackdown. Italy's been much harder under Meloni. Germany, Angela Merkel's "you are all welcome" has turned very sour for Germany. So it is something that, again, and it comes back to your point earlier about Europe, it is something that Europe needs to do properly. And, you know, the simple answer, such as these things are, is you set up legal, safe routes where people can go and say, right, I'm going to apply for asylum. Right, okay, where do you want to be? You want to be in England. Why? Because I've got an auntie there. But you keep those people in that place. And so if you speed up that process of legal migration and you allow people who have been here for 6 months or something to work, and, you know, you begin to sort of get them paying tax and working legally, you begin to change the shape of it, and we can go back to being the tolerant, welcoming country that a small island can only ever be if it is to succeed.
Jim, immigration, I know this is something that you've rightly identified as a key issue for Labour to tackle if they are to maintain the support in those working class sort of traditional areas. Do you think that they've made a good fist of it thus far?
I'm afraid not. No, I don't think it's made much difference at all. There are some impenetrable truths about this. It is fueled by international instability, poverty, the attraction of Britain because we speak the English language, and a lot of people have got relatives here, and also that whatever the French say, once they're in France, their basic instinct is to usher them through to the United Kingdom. There's a huge contradiction. Whatever Macron says and however much money he takes from us to assist us, the basic thing is that the French, and understandably, if they want to come to Britain, is to usher them through. I'm very concerned what Joe says about after 6 months they should be allowed to work. And that's starting to integrate them into the British economy. The problem we have is the perception that there are too many people, that this country cannot take all these people. I know we need specific skills for building bricks and things like that, but a lot of these are young men without those skills. And I just fear a huge reaction. I think
Jim,
it's very difficult.
Just to come back on that, if you are waiting for 2 years for your asylum application to be processed, you are hanging around, probably in some, hotel somewhere or in a house of multiple occupation. The locals don't want you. You can't do anything legally. Somebody offers you a job on the quiet, cash in hand, you're going to take it. Whereas if your application is in process, presumably there must be a way of saying after 6 months, because it is our fault that it's so slow, the government's fault and the previous government's fault, that you should allow those people to work, and then you can keep tabs on them. Because at the moment, you can't keep tabs on them.
It's a hellishly difficult.
It's terrible. I mean, nobody's got an answer for it.
To tackle that. And I've a lot of sympathy with what you say, Joe, because you want people to be as economically active as they can and less of a drain on resource. I think the trick really is to speed up applications, isn't it? As
Exactly.
you said earlier,
Yeah.
so that people aren't waiting for 2 years to get their application. And again, what Yvette Cooper has indicated is that she wouldn't be against the idea of offshoring a lot of these people, not to Rwanda, but to somewhere who, closer to home, that met with the ECHR rules, and that might be a way forward. But
This can I just
think,
on this
I think the one thing I
ECHR?
would say, Jim, just a little pushback on you. I mean, 24,000 returns in 7 months. That's some going. That is significantly increased in terms of numbers than what were being shipped back under the Tories.
But 4,000 came illegally in March. That's huge.
On the ECHR, can I just, presumably these judges are making these rulings because the interpretations of, I've got a family here or whatever it is embedded in the ECHR guidelines. So, the fact that I had a flicker of doubt about whether we should stay in the ECHR really shocked me, because I think it would be a fundamental statement of us moving away from the sort of country we are. But is it possible? I understand the Danes have done this. They've found a way of reinterpreting what the ECHR says. But do we need some reform of that rather than actually having to leave?
Yvette Cooper has said she's looking at that particular section, which is the right to family life, and that's the one that gets everybody caught. We can't send this convicted criminal back to wherever he came from because it will deprive his children of a family life. Well, and I think that is the one that's used. And I completely agree with you, Jim, because I find myself thinking, good God, I've turned into a Daily Mail reader. Shoot me. But it is about the interpretation, and there is, with some justification, criticism of the lawyers who will bend the rules to the absolute end to get people here, which actually doesn't help anybody.
No, spot on. Well, listen, if we're looking for some optimism around the government's willingness to challenge the law, then we look no further than our Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, who is today saying that she will not allow the Sentencing Council guidelines to come forward, which she describes as providing a two-tier justice system. Joe, do you want to explain what's going on here?
Yeah, so the Sentencing Council is a sort of an arm's length body that's been in existence for several years, and it is a sort of an advisory body to judges, as the clues in the name, before they give sentencing. And what they came out with was actually, funny enough, it was based on a report that David Lammy did back in 2017, and about the need to take into consideration people's backgrounds. And the thing that hit the headlines was that it was going to go, it's going to make it more lenient for ethnic minorities, women, and migrants probably, and so on and so forth. And that, of course, had fueled the fire of Robert Jenrick, particularly. I mean, this is where the government is, it's a whole different conversation, really. But, is the government now dancing to Robert Jenrick's tune? And what they need to do is to find their own words, not use the ones that the Tories are using. And so this sense of two-tier justice. Now, sensible people like Baroness Helena Kennedy and many others say it is really important that judges understand the background of people before they are sentenced. And in particular, that might concern women, obviously younger people, and people from certain ethnic minorities. Now, that makes perfect common sense. But if the idea or the implicit proposal is that you are going to be more lenient, that seems wrong. Everybody should be equal before the law. So what Shabana Mahmood said to the Sentencing Council was basically, go away, have a look at these recommendations and come back with something a bit more sensible. They said, no chance, love, you get these. So now she's actually looking at an emergency law, and these new guidelines are due to come into force tomorrow, I think. She's now looking at an emergency law this week, which I think might end up with the dismantling of the Sentencing Council. Because the other thing, very quickly on this, who is going to compile these reports? Probation officers. Have we got a lot of probation officers sitting around twiddling their thumbs? No. So, I think it's one of those things where if the government is seen to be being tough, and I think she's doing quite well as Justice Secretary, actually, I think, you can do things and you can say, yep, we hear you, we're dealing with it. Thank you very much. Let's move on. And those are the things I think that will, in the end, where people will see and feel the difference of a Labour government, that yes, they are listening. Unfortunately, they're not listening on everything, but that's a good one. And the fact that she's got David Gauke, the former Tory prisons minister, overseeing and working with James Timpson, on the whole sense of prison and reoffending, that's really good. That's really sensible, thorough. Let's try and make it work.
And I have to say to you, Joe, it's wound up Conservative Home, which of course is the daily news bulletin that the Conservative Party, it's sort of Bible for the Tories in terms of its reading, because they're saying, why on earth didn't we do this when the courts were kicking back against some of the legislation we wanted to introduce in the last government? So she's doing a good job. I think she's absolutely right in terms of the view she's taken. I've got no problem at all in pre-sentencing reports being reviewed as part of the sentencing procedure, but that pre-sentence report should be for everyone, not just for people from particular ethnic minorities or gender. So good on it. Jim, I'm just going to give you the last word for the first part of the programme on domestic issues, because I know you spent an afternoon, was it, with Nigel Farage?
Yes. He was speaking at Westminster at an event that I attended last Thursday, and was can I just before I do that, can I just say that on the previous subject, that obviously people who are concerned about this piled in with what they say is the fact is that more black people are locked up and for longer statistically, and that's what in a sense fueled that controversy. Now, I don't know what the rights and wrong, well, I think it is statistically probably true, but that in my opinion doesn't negate the need, as you say, for pre-sentencing reports. No, Nigel Farage, he is a bravura performer. He's very much in the Trump mold. I mean, he started off by saying, because this was an assembly of lobby journalists, people that write about politics in Westminster. You've written about me that I'm a heavy smoker, I'm a heavy drinker, and I'm a womanizer. All those things are true. Now, of course, it brought the house down, and I thought for a moment, this man actually isn't serious, that he's going through his life attracting attention. And there are people like that who basically just want to attract attention without any serious commitment to political progress. But from there on, he, in his robust way, was quite an attractive speaker. The way a bit like Tony Benn in the old days. He has a way of connecting various disparate issues together, and making a case. Of course, it wasn't really an opportunity to fully examine him on various policies. And I'm sounding like a broken record on these podcasts, but we're coming up to these county council elections, and I really hope that our regional media, particularly in Lancashire, ask Reform candidates, what are you going to do about the roads and the potholes and social care in Lancashire? Because there's a great danger that a lot of these people are going to be elected to county councils without a clue about what to do. I'm not making direct comparisons, but the BNP got some councillors elected in Lancashire in the early noughties, and they were absolutely hopeless. So I'm hoping, but he gave a bravura performance. You can see why he attracts support. He one or two questions we asked him about the relationship with Trump. There was some unease there. He sort of does this Trump will be Trump. But I think that's a possible area of weakness. If Trump continues on his current trajectory, I think that could be damaging for Farage. But I did sort of agree with him that the row he had with Lowe, the expulsion of this MP, the people in the north of England don't pay much attention to that. And that's what it was. He knows how to work journalists. We have to be honest about it as journalists. We like a good story, and Farage has provided us with a good story over the last decade or two. But he's not great on the detail. I don't think he's great on paying attention to detail, and I think that could be his undoing. But in the current mood about some of the things we've been discussing this morning, my great worry about politics in general in relation to Farage is that if the Conservatives abysmally failed, if Labour can't get their act together, there is a chance that people will turn to simplistic solutions in the future.
Right, thanks, Jim, for that very brief commentary on. I thought we were going to get a fucking minute-by-minute blow there. But anyway, listen, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to be talking about the Donald and Turkey. So stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. Me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips. Now, if we were to take every international situation and issue into account, then we could spend the next week talking about the many things that are happening across the globe politically. And just in America, we have so many things happening that it's difficult to keep up with. We're going to try and focus our attention on a couple of things that Mr. Trump and his vice president have been up to this week, starting with this claim that he can go for a third term, President Trump. He's saying in an interview yesterday that he's serious about this, that he thinks it's quite legitimate that he should stand again for president. He wishes to 4 years' time. So for all of those people who are consoling themselves with the fact that we've only got 3.5 years left of this madness, Mr. Trump has other ideas. Now, I take the point that many people have made, including American constitutional experts, that this simply won't be allowed to happen. But how many times have we heard over the past couple of months, oh, that's never going to happen? Donald Trump says these things, but then he gets back in his box and wiser counsel prevails. I wouldn't put it past him, at least to attempt the third term option. And it has been done in the past. There have been American presidents in the past who served more than 2 terms. So, Jim, where do you think this is going to take us? His age isn't necessarily in favour of them, and I don't think his vice president will be too pleased hearing those words either. But nevertheless, he is serious about it, I think.
Well, when I was reporting on Franklin Roosevelt's presidency in the 1930s, I recall he, of course, stood and was elected 4 times. And after that, an amendment was passed to the Constitution saying that there should only be 2 terms. And as I understand it, in order to overturn that amendment, it would require supermajorities in both houses of Congress. And I think 3/4 of the states of the United States would have to approve it on a state basis. Now, he might well go for it, but unless he succeeded in that, I just don't see there's any other way for him to do it.
Which the decision was made. Could he sign an executive order? Could he say, well, America is on a war footing, and therefore, as you argued, all you liberals, over Zelensky, why should I stand down? We're in war here. You know, we're at war with the immigrants. We're at war with whoever else. Well, Greenland, by the time the next election comes round, we'll come on to that in a moment. We're at war with Canada potentially. Would he not be able to use that, Jim, as a way of getting round those constitutional barriers?
Well, I two things on that. I'm not sufficiently of an expert to think that by an executive order he could grant himself the opportunity of standing for a 3rd term. But ultimately, I suppose the most likely course of action would be a challenge by the Democrats to the Supreme Court. And then, of course, we come to the Supreme Court, which I'm pleased to say a little bit in the last few months has begun to push back a bit. We thought they were a complete patsy for Trump and made this very damaging ruling that almost anything that a president does in office is okay. But well, as you say, we live in unprecedented times, but, you know, to imagine that the Supreme Court would agree that we were at war when the meaning of war means an international conflict on a big scale, not at war with immigrants coming across the border. That's an interpretation of war that I would imagine the Supreme Court would strike down. But, you know, there's a sliver of possibility of that.
Joe? 3rd term for Mr. Trump?
I think, you know, in 3.5 years, God knows, he'll have colonised Mars, you know, bought up the rest of Scotland and started a war with J.D. Vance. But I think, you know, I was just looking at the American Constitution, as I do, just to see it is the 22nd Amendment. But I mean, I'm sure, you know, if he can find a way around it, and I was about to say exactly what you said, that you could say, well, we're at war. You know, we are at war. He's only got to declare he's at war. But I am quite pleased, as Jim just said, to see that some of the judiciary are beginning to fight back. What needs to happen is the Democrats need to fight back. They need to get their act together, which they should have done, you know, 5-6 years ago, and begin to start looking at who are they going to put up at the midterms, who are they going to put up as governors, and where they're going to begin the fight back. Because the fight back isn't coming from ordinary Americans, and that will only happen when the economy really tanks, and it will be more than the price of eggs.
Yeah, AOC is the most impressive Democrat at the moment. She's out there with Bernie Sanders, actually doing some incredible rallies all over the country. And then the voters, you know, in these town hall gatherings that political geeks like me take great interest in watching the clips from, and the Republicans are getting, you know, a really rough ride at these town hall gatherings, which are a traditional part of the American political system. And you do hope that, we talk about the Democrats giving their heads a wobble, you do hope that the GOP, the Grand Old Party, at some point will say, we've got to try and restore some sanity into this country. But there's no sign of that yet. They're so frit of Donald Trump. The guy who is obviously not wishing for a 3rd Trump term will be his vice president, who is trying to line himself up as the natural successor to President Trump, and that's J.D. Vance. And he was in Greenland this week, basically telling the Danes that the United States is going to take over that part of the world for security purposes. And again, we can be quite sniffy about this and laugh and joke and say, oh, as if that's going to happen. But I wouldn't put anything past this mob. And what will Europe be able to do if America just simply decided we're going to annex Denmark and we're taking it off you guys because it's such a crucial part for our strategic security purposes, which is the rationale behind the statements that JD Vance is making?
Well, it's astonishing. I mean, he turned up in Greenland where he hadn't really been invited. Apparently, Mrs. Vance is little known, but is a great fan, apparently, for all of 24 Hours of dog sled racing. So that was her ostensible visit. He tagged along. He'd got a parka that had still got the creases in from coming out of the shop. He could have probably taken it back to the shop, having only worn it for 20 minutes.
He probably did.
And they probably did. And, you know, spoke to American press who travelled with him, American military personnel at an American airbase. He could have done the whole thing by Zoom. He wasn't quite so rude about Denmark as he had been about Europe when he did the Munich Security Conference. But there were a couple of things that were incredibly chilling. One is, you know, we're going to take it anyway, pretty much. The other thing is, we're really worried about the threat of Russia. Hello, but you're not worried about the threat of Russia to Ukraine and the rest of Europe. How weird is that? And the other thing that really sent a chill down my spine was this idea that as the ice caps, as the polar ice is melting, which obviously most people who've got half a brain would think is quite serious, they see it as an opportunity for new waterways. And hey, those minerals will come. We can all go and get the minerals. So, you know, there are some issues and there are some concerns, but of course America has got military bases in Greenland. It's got submarine docks, it's got harbours, it's got lots of stuff that it could keep all of that without having to take it over and own it. And I just think, you know, at the moment they are shooting craps left, right and centre, and then doubling back, doubling down, U-turning and everything else. And there is going to be a point where people are going to stop taking them seriously, because they say, one day we think Putin's a great guy, the next, no, I'm really disappointed. You can't keep on at that level of intensity and nonsense. And then, of course, what you haven't mentioned, Frank, is all the time you're shooting craps on that, nobody's talking about the signal gate thing.
I was going to come on to that because
it's unbelievable.
But just before you do, I don't know if you noticed, and I thought this was very significant, Putin made a speech last week where he was referring to various things. And when it came to the United States' claim for Greenland, he merely described it as interesting. That the implication being that for all that Trump says we've got to guard against Russia, that actually, you know, you don't know what's going on in the back channels between Putin and Trump. But it sort of sounded to me as if Putin was going to take a benign view about the US annexation of Greenland. Now, the only other thing...
Almost, Jim, we'll give you Ukraine if you don't kick up a fuss about Greenland, and then we might have a little look at Canada, and you might want to have a look at Belarus. And, you know, it definitely seems to me that there is a view from the White House that we have basically 3 world superpowers, and you split the world up between them. One is the States, one is Russia, and the other, of course, is China. The least favourable to Trump is China, of course. And at some point, we do need to wake up and smell the coffee. As I say, we can dismiss these things as nonsense up to a point. But when those conversations are happening at that level, Russian president to American president, shall we carve the world up in this way? I'm afraid that the European leaders are going to have to be more exercised than a bloody fishing war in the North Sea, or whether or not, you know, we're going to have procurement processes in place that include the UK. We are a 4th pillar in this new world order, and we are going to carve out our own future.
Yes, and I need to point out, of course, that in NATO, an attack on one is an attack on all. So if the United States attacks Denmark, what's our response going to be?
Well, that's a NATO ally against a NATO ally. That'd be quite a tough one. But let's talk about signal, because the one good thing that we might be able to take advantage of, as the UK intelligence services are among the best, if not the best in the world, is basically finding out exactly what the Yanks are up to, because they copied in. For those who've not been following this story, there is a platform similar to WhatsApp, but it's supposedly far more secure. And I guess it is more secure in the hands of the right people, but not if you're in the defense department of the United States, because basically they have this signal group talking about an attack on the Houthis, and they copy in a journalist. They basically add a journalist to this group, which includes the Vice President, includes the Secretary of Defense for the United States, Rubio, a whole host of people in there. And they're basically outlining within this signal conversation the military attack on the Houthis. Joe, if this was, I would say, any other country in the world, never mind if this was the UK, talk about heads would be rolling. Can you imagine the uproar that would have occurred if...
Yeah. It's, I mean, it puts Boris Johnson's lost WhatsApp messages into, sharp relief, doesn't it? It is astonishing, first of all, that there should be a group chat about the time and the weapons and the planes that were going to be involved in these raids, these attacks. So there was Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, Marco Rubio, as you said, various other people, Tulsi Gabbard, the head of security, Mike Waltz, and various other people. But they inadvertently invited, he wasn't just copied in, he was invited to join the group, Jeff Goldberg, the editor of The Atlantic. Now, that is a reputable and sensible journal. Even though, Trump and everybody else said, oh, it's rubbish, it's going out of business. He chose not to publish the details, just basically said he'd been included. Wasn't that extraordinary? What a security breach. The Trump administration said, oh, it's rubbish, it's a hoax, it's all made up. I mean, you can't believe that sensible, grown-up people who speak the same language as we do could actually even begin to deny something that is so transparently a fact. So then The Atlantic published the entire text, if you like, which included the times, the number of planes, at which point, it goes beyond, okay, well, this is just a light plan. This is stuff that would put military service personnel at risk. Oh, and if it had got into the wrong hands, it could have actually been incredibly dangerous. Now, quite why any of those people are in post, God only knows, because it is an appalling lapse and it should never have happened. And can I just say, because it's never the same without me and Jim talking about a film, I went to see Dr. Strangelove on Thursday, which is the new version with Steve Coogan reprising the role that Peter Sellers played. And I sat there and I thought, well, bloody hell, here they are in the war room, and this could be written today, just after the signal leak.
Did they have that famous thing that Sellers said? There was a row going on in the war room, and it nearly came to blows. And they said, "You can't fight in here. This is the war room."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, all of that. Yeah, no, it's absolutely brilliant. I thoroughly recommend it.
Yeah, I mean, just my thoughts
quickly to because, as I say, we could probably spend 10 hours on what's going on in America at this moment in time because of all the stuff that's coming out. I noticed that the stock market has taken a dive in anticipation of Trump's Liberation Day, where he's going to set 25% tariffs. And of course, the UK are trying to do a side deal. That may have implications for our relationship with the EU. We'll look at that next week, if we may. I want to spend some time talking about something that is concerning me greatly, which is Erdoğan and Turkey, and basically democracy being suspended in one of the biggest countries in Europe, not a member of the EU, of course, but a crucial country as far as the Ukrainian war is concerned, and a NATO ally at that. So, Jim, Turkey, what is going on there, and is this just yet another example of populism on the rise?
Yes, it is. Erdogan does have support we need to understand the makeup of Turkey, because obviously we're attracted to these huge urban protests. It was the case, and maybe remains the case, that Erdogan's main popularity resides in the countryside, where people are more religious and actually support the religious side of Turkey, whereas people in the towns believe that the country should be secular. So that's a tension there. But this locking up of the opposition leader that Joe will pronounce with great elegance in a few moments' time is absolutely an example of that. But the thing that I find intriguing, and which didn't get a lot of publicity last week, was the Turkish opposition Labour Party, which is affiliated to the British Labour Party. Their spokesman was absolutely angry at the lack of response from Sir Keir Starmer and the Foreign Secretary in this country to the locking up of this opponent. And we then come to the old issue of pragmatism, which is frequently displayed in relation to Saudi Arabia, that when it comes to a country that's absolutely vital to us, and Turkey is both on defence grounds and also the cooperation they've given to some extent with the immigration problems that we have, that we are more reticent because we've got to be pragmatic. And I'd be interested in you guys' views on this eternal problem of British foreign policy, which is, how idealistic can we be and how pragmatic should we be?
Yeah. Joe, you pronounce the name of the opposition leader that's been locked up, please.
He is Ekrem İmamoğlu, and he is the mayor of Istanbul, and he's been locked up.
Used to be centre forward for Norwich City. No, very joking. Erdogan, he's one of those very difficult people, because there have been points when Turkey under his leadership have been incredibly useful. They have been extremely strategic in dealing with Syria, not least of all with refugees. They're also, geographically, historically and culturally, they are at the epicenter of Europe and the East, if you like. So it is a hugely important area for everyone in Europe and outside of Europe to have a thing. But you just sort of think, so Erdogan has got this guy, he's very popular, the mayor of Istanbul. Why doesn't he just let him stand against him and campaign instead of locking him up, plunging the country into total crisis, bringing people out on the streets who were probably not particularly politically engaged before, and then now saying, I'm not fighting particularly for a political party, I'm fighting for my democratic right. And it's the sort of thing that we can see it spreads. Do they then have a quicker crackdown? I mean, we saw Mark Lowen, the BBC's correspondent, expelled from Turkey. There's another journalist who's been held and locked up in Turkey, a British or American, I think. And I think it's very worrying that this can happen on our patch, if you like. But I think if you look at the playbook that Erdogan is using, it's not a million miles away from Donald Trump's.
Exactly.
And I think that within the next 12 months, you will see cases being brought against Trump's political opponents in the United States. I don't think that's even questionable now, given some of the antics that he's been up to. If you look at the way in which he's sidelining, silencing the media, that's dangerous as well. It's things that you would never have thought would be able to come out of the United States. If you look at the way in which the narrative is coming about this third term that we talked about earlier, Trump wants to be forever Trump, forever President Trump. And Erdogan, obviously, has been in now for 20 years, I think it is. And the irony of this, of course, is when he was elected, he was seen as the modernizer.
Yeah.
A little bit in the mould of a Tony Blair, actually, new broom, secular, as you say, Jim. That was where he started his political journey. And over that 20-year period, these buggers just get too big for the boots, I'm afraid, and become all powerful. So this populist playbook is starting to happen all across the world, I'm afraid. And whether we talk about India, we talk about the States, we talk about now Turkey, look at what's happened in Russia, it is very concerning, very worrying. And, you hope that it doesn't come to these shores, but we know that there are people within this country who would love autocracy. And I don't mean necessarily our good friend, Jim's mate, Nigel Farage. There are people far to the right of him who are supported by Elon Musk who would love that sort of approach to politics in this country. So it's a worrying time. Final thing on international affairs, breaking news, and this is another populist who's found herself in a bit of trouble with the courts, and that is Marine Le Pen, who has been found guilty of EU funding embezzlement. So this would potentially exclude her from running for the French presidency in 2027. Jim, I'm quite interested in your take on this. I thought it was a good one in terms of the courts perhaps going after a populist, not necessarily being the best way forward for the French.
Well, I just wonder, and see what Joe says about this, that this could create quite a dangerous situation in France, because it's almost the same playbook as Trump when he faced those charges about his behavior and trying to get extra votes and overturn the election. And he managed to turn it, saying, look at these courts, they're all run by liberals and people, they're preventing you, the people, from your own choice. And I imagine Mrs. Le Pen would, if she is debarred from standing, would appeal to the French people on those grounds. And then the question would be, how do the French people react? And I think Joe's got an interesting view on this, but I think it, potentially could cause some instability in France.
Mm-hmm. Joe?
Well, I think the French are much more or much less tolerant, actually, of misdemeanors. They don't mind people having affairs and mistresses and, a bit on the side, whether you're president or, running the local épicier. But I do think when it comes to embezzling funds, I think they would take a pretty dim view of it. I mean, they are still, they are a country, a state that is still founded in, broadly speaking, socialism, if you like. And although I think Marine Le Pen will appeal to her supporters, and her supporters will probably rally around her, I have a feeling that the French public generally, and the French press, who are, quite serious, they're not quite so flimsy as some outlets around the world, may take a very dim view of this.
I'm reading the breaking news story from the BBC site now, and it's not absolutely clear as to whether she will be excluded yet from standing for the presidency in 2027, because there will be an appeal pending. So it will be very much up to the courts to decide whether she was able to stand pending that appeal or not. So we will see, and I'm sure that more will emerge from that particular story as the day progresses. So guys, listen, we've spent far too much time on our podcast today. I need to get back to work. Jim needs to get back to his bath and his snooze for the rest of the day. And Joe, I'm sure you've got things to do as well. So thanks for joining us for this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. We'll be back again next week. Lord knows what will happen over the next 7 days, but I'm sure it will be of interest, and we'll be here to discuss it all with you. Have a great week, everyone. See you soon.